All right. So we welcome everybody. Hey, it is Jen Harmon here with Metro Nashville Public Works. I am so excited to see we've got lots of folks filtering in today for our Sustainable in the City Thinking Upstream, our second episode today. So we're going to wait for just a few minutes to let everybody get in the room, and then we'll get started with our discussion. We've got a lot to talk about today. Very excited. So we're just going to kind of hang out here for a few minutes. We'll get started right about 12:03 or so.
Excellent. Yes, 12:03. Hello, everyone. This is Patrick from Urban Green Lab. Really excited to have you all here, and can't wait to really get into it and start unpacking big plastic and the economics behind recycling. There should be some really good stuff today.
Absolutely. And it's a great day for it too. Yesterday was so beautiful. I think if we had done this yesterday, a lot of folks would have skipped it for their lunch break to get outside and go for a walk. Today's a little cooler out, a little bit more crisp. So
Yeah.
kind of worked out for us in that way.
A little cooler, a little more crisp. And if you haven't checked the forecast, apparently it's supposed to start snowing at 3 p.m. So I really enjoyed yesterday because it's going to be a little bit of the opposite today.
I saw like what 0.25 inches or something, that tiny little, like just that enough amount of snow that the bread shelves are going to be empty and people are going to panic. So
I hate when that happens because I never need anything more than celery, and it's always celery in bread as well. I guess people are just stocking up for stocks and soups, but I don't know.
One of the things over the pandemic that I have been super surprised has been out of stock. So toilet paper makes sense, cleaning products make sense, staple items make sense, but tofu. All through the pandemic, there were months that I could not find tofu. Very strange. I'm very glad to have tofu back in my life, though.
I would say tofu is a staple for certain people, yourself included.
Yeah, I guess it would be a staple for me.
Yeah.
Maybe I was just surprised that so many people were enjoying tofu that I could not enjoy the tofu. All right, so let's see, it looks like we've got a good number of folks in, and our number has trickled to a slow, so we still got more folks coming in. So we are going to go ahead and get started on our webinar today. Already have some good questions coming in. I've got to zoom that down so we can get started. I'll get back to the chat in just a minute. So hey, everybody, again, my name is Jen Harmon. I'm with Metro Nashville Public Works, and I am here with my fabulous co-host, Patrick King with Urban Green Lab, and you are here for our second edition of Sustainable in the City, Thinking Upstream. Now, this is a collaborative, in-depth series that features interviews, presentations, and panel discussions with Nashville's top experts in all areas of waste and sustainability. Now, in our first episode, I took you on a deep dive into how plastic is recycled here in Nashville. So if you haven't checked that one out, we'll make sure to get a link in there so that you can watch that first episode if you didn't join us for it. But today, Patrick is going to help us build on that exploration of plastic recycling with a more global perspective from our very special guests, Dr. Emily Jones and Ph.D. candidate Michael Crouch.
Excellent. So a few reminders before we get started. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Urban Green Lab's YouTube channel. Just Urban Green Lab on YouTube, should be able to find it. There you'll be able to find all of our previous episodes and much, much more. And if you also haven't not subscribed, but if you want to stay connected and up to date on all the goings-ons with Sustainable in the City Thinking Upstream, be sure to subscribe to Urban Green Lab's newsletter, as well as Public Works Get Rowdy Recycling newsletter, and Jen will be providing those links in the chat. And Urban Green Lab is a nonprofit, so if you feel so inclined to support the work that we do, feel free to make a donation. You can make one on our website at urbangreenlab.org, or you can text Team UGL, all one word, to 44321, and you'll get a link sent to your phone. And I'm going to toss it right back to you, Jen.
And yes, and a few notes. So let's go over how the session is going to run today so we can make sure everything runs smoothly. So Patrick is going to be leading our discussion today with our panelists for about 45 minutes. We've got some great questions and some great conversation. And then afterwards, we'll have some time for questions from you all, our audience. So I'll be hanging out in the chat and checking on that, monitoring that, and then also leading that final Q&A. If you do have questions you want to ask the panel, Today, this is different from our last session. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom and do not ask those questions in the chat. We are going to be using that Q&A function. So it's down at the bottom in your controls. It's got two little question and answer bubbles and it says Q&A. So use that to ask any questions that you want asked in that Q&A at the end to our panels. So I'll be pulling the questions from there. If you do have technical issues or those types of questions, just shoot me a private chat. A private message in the chat. You can do it just to me, and feel free to use the chat though to connect with each other, share, react to what's being talked about. If you have any thoughts or if you have any resources, feel free to share that in the chat. You should all be able to chat with each other through that feature. Just make sure that those questions for the panel do go into the Q&A. So that's how it's going to run. We're going to go ahead. We've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to jump in now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to throw it back to you, Patrick, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jen. And as she said, we do have some really awesome folks on our panel. First up, we have Dr. Michael Crouch. He's a PhD student at Vanderbilt, but before beginning his PhD, Michael worked in research and grant evaluation. He previously received his bachelor's degree in economics from Harrman University and got his master's in public policy in economics from Pepperdine. And we also have Dr. Emily Jones Stutzman, Dr. Stutzman Jones, and she is the academic director at Lipscomb Institute for Sustainable Practice. She holds a master's degree in rural sociology and a PhD in forestry from Harvard University. And her past research applies to the sociology of conservation and natural resources management in the context of sustainability. To both of our panelists, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get right on into it. Could you both kind of just start by giving us a brief overview of what exactly plastic is, where it comes from, and how it was first synthesized?
Yeah. So plastic is an adjective that means moldable during manufacturing. And that's a great quality. Moldable during manufacturing is something we want in materials. The problem with most plastic products that we're going to be talking about here is that they do not degrade over time. They persist in the environment. They're seemingly everywhere, and collecting and transporting them and recycling them is costly. And currently that financial cost is borne by citizens and communities, not by producers.
Right. So Emily is correct there in the way that she's talking about who bears the cost of taking a plastic. Plastics are beneficial in many of the ways that we use them. We're thankful that for the many different ways, because they're moldable, because we're able to use them in different scenarios, there's a lot of good that can come from plastics. However, Emily, we've talked about this before. When you buy a plastic, you're not just buying the use of the plastic. You're also buying the getting rid of process, the destruction of the plastic, whether it's used for some other good in the future, which is what we'd like to think happens with recycling, or if it's just going into a landfill. And of course, we'll talk more about that later, I'm sure. But plastics aren't just what we use them for, it's the whole life cycle of the plastic.
Absolutely.
An important consideration is that most of the plastic material circulating through our systems today is made from fossil fuel.
Yeah. Yeah, and just a quick shameless promotion. If you were not here for our first session, we really dive into plastic and how it is recycled locally and kind of regionally in the Middle Tennessee region. And Emily, great point, just talking about how those plastics just exist in our environment right now. 91% of all plastic ever produced has never been recycled. The plastic industry has known since the 1970s that large-scale plastic recycling could never be economically viable. Michael, could you maybe explain why that is and tell us a little bit more about what prevents large-scale recycling from being economically impossible?
Sure. Dr. Jones and I are both professors. We lean on our PowerPoint sometimes. So I'm going to do a quick screen share to put up a slide that I would put in front of my economics class. So this isn't day one of economics 101, but it's later on in the semester. And perhaps this will help us as we think through what it means for the economic jargon. And I promise we won't get too much into the math here, but I did want us to look at this. What we have here is, on our x-axis here, down here, we're saying, is it more recycled? That's over here. Or is it more so going towards a landfill? That's what's over here. And so the cost of doing that is measured up and down. Okay. And what we have here are a couple of lines. This green line is our marginal cost of recycling. What's the marginal cost of something? Well, I like to think about it in this way. I try to do sit-ups. It's my New Year's resolution. I'm going to do 100 sit-ups every day. The first sit-up that I do is really easy. As I'm sitting, I'm like, hey, this is great. I'm so glad that I made this New Year's resolution. But by the time I get to 95, take a breath. 90, as I get to those last ones, the difficulty of it goes up. And so we see the same thing in recycling. Some things are super easy to recycle. In fact, they're even negative in their cost of recycling. It would hurt us not to recycle them. And some things cost us a little bit. And when I say cost, it's not just money, it's also our time. It's our effort. It's our brain power to know where to recycle those things. And we can imagine that as we go along this curve, there are some things that are really easy to recycle, but other things are actually fairly difficult to recycle, not just in terms of cost, but also knowing where, as consumers, we should be recycling them. So that's why we have this upward sloping line of the marginal cost of recycling. On the other hand, the marginal cost of disposing is flat. Now, we could argue about this. We could say that there's cost to other people, but for me, I know where my trash can is. In fact, I have several trash cans around my house. And so the cost to me, both in terms of my physical labor, my mental ability, and the money that I spend now in Nashville, I actually pay my trash collector personally. Everywhere else I've ever lived, it was part of my city bill. It was not even something that I ever thought about. So that cost of disposing, of putting something in the trash can, is flat. So for everyone, these lines are different, obviously, but for anyone, they have somewhere where they come up with a place where they're going to recycle some things and not recycle others, throw them away. And so anyway, I will stop sharing my screen now. But basically what we're seeing here is that every person has a cost that they have. So the question was, why can't we have large scale recycling? Well, for some things we are able to recycle, and it's fairly easy. In fact, it might even be beneficial for the companies and for the consumers. We could both make a little money off of it. On the other hand, there are some things that are really difficult. Now, I suppose one of the things we'll talk about today is how do we edge up that, how do we marginally move up that line, move up a little bit to make sure that we're getting the things that are easy. And while we might say that not everything can be recycled, we want to make sure and get the low-hanging fruit first.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael, back to your slide. So I understand how that applies to individuals with their knowledge, attention, willingness to recycle more and more difficult things. Does that marginal cost also rise? Can we assume that it does, at least at the municipal level?
Yes. So the marginal cost of landfill that I put forward, we could talk about the marginal cost for the city might actually be a little less if the city is working together. At the same time, the marginal cost of recycling can also go down based off of a city putting effort into it. And currently in Nashville, I have the option of whether or not I want my blue box. Well, if everyone just got a blue box by default, this is kind of a nudge principle of economics. If we made it the default selection was to get a blue box for recycling, then we would probably see the cost go down. It would just be easier for people to use those things. Another thing that we can talk about later is easy descriptions within the packaging to help people know this is where it goes, rather than just a circle with a number in the middle. On some of our larger boxes, like, here's how you do it, here's where you take it, and making that an easier process.
Thanks.
Yeah, Michael, great point of kind of equating that to like the marginal cost of recycling. And I'd be interested to learn kind of more about that nudge theory that you just mentioned, but we can talk about that a little bit more later. But best of luck on your New Year's resolutions and the diminishing returns of doing sit-ups.
Hopefully I'll see results sometime in the future.
All right, moving on. So next question here. Through a desire to keep the public happy about purchasing plastic products, in 1988, the Council for Solid Waste Solutions was created by DuPont. Its executive board was made up of representatives from AMCO, Chevron, Dow, Exxon, and many other large petrochemical corporations that produce plastic. The council aimed the idea of selling all that plastic, sell the idea that all plastics can be recycled, but that burden, they put that burden on the public and municipal governments. Could you both talk a little bit about the impact that this has had and continues to have on recycling behaviors today? And perhaps maybe kind of getting into that numbering system and symbols.
I want to point out that this was absolutely a strategic move on the part of petrochemical companies. There's a fantastic book and also documentary by Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt. If you haven't seen Merchants of Doubt, put that on your documentary queue. And they outline the ways that corporations strategically create public perceptions in order to delay action to address environmental and health problems, which are caused by those corporations. The best examples being from the tobacco industry, the decades in which tobacco companies delayed action on tobacco regulation. So one of the main strategies is creating groups, front groups like this Council for Solid Waste that draw attention from the source of the problem and redirect attention to another and place the spotlight on another place. And this has been done quite effectively to the point that, studying sustainability in grad school and then coming to, meet undergraduates and just kind of members of the public. When I go around, it's almost assumed that what I'm going to talk about is telling them how to recycle, as if that is the mission of, that is the goal of sustainability. So I think that is, that has been effective. And I think now that we know, since the 1970s, large-scale plastic recycling is not an economically viable activity, and it's getting more and more difficult as plastic volume rises. The reversal and another redirection that community groups that leaders are looking to is what's called extended producer responsibility. So putting the spotlight back on the production, where producers retain the responsibility for their products throughout that product's whole life cycle, while those products change hands. So including that cost as internalizing the cost of the disposal of the packaging in the product's life cycle cost, which brings it into the equation that businesses use when making decisions of how to generate profit based on charging the highest price viable as well as the lowest costs available. So we've seen this happen. In a generation or two, it was commonplace for glass Coke bottles, for example, and milk jugs. The container was owned by the bottling company and circulated repeatedly until either it broke or was, they would get rough around the edges from so much contact with other bottles that, thousands of uses. So moving towards extended producer responsibility is I would say the foremost strategy that folks are using to put the spotlight back on producers for the responsibility of packaging, especially.
Yeah.
So thinking about the interest group that was formed by these different chemical companies and its use to the solid waste group. One thing I think we should say is that we shouldn't be surprised that this group has been formed, right? Sure. Every industry has its interest group where all of the companies within that industry come together to essentially form a political action committee, or actually that's a legal term, an interest group that is able to lobby governing officials both at the federal level, the state level, the local level, probably even at the international level. There's some level of lobbying going on. And while we shouldn't be surprised by that, we should also not be surprised that they would promote research, if we can call it that, that is within their own self-interest, in the same way that other groups would do the same thing. And so we have this combating of ideas, right? While I think all of us would be very quick to say that lying is wrong, there is some types of research where you say, well, it's not technically a lie, but you're not telling us everything about what we should know. In the same way that we shouldn't be surprised by that, we should also not be surprised that politicians are self-interested individuals. The number one way to predict what politicians will do is what will get them reelected. Most of the time they think that the things that they agree with, their values, are the things that are going to get them reelected. So once again, politicians aren't necessarily bad people, but they're pursuing things that are going to help them get reelected. And often because these ideas around plastic have not been in the mainstream, there's not an incentive for politicians to go after policies that are serving of all people. Rather, they can go after the special interest groups who have that concentrated interest to move policy on their behalf. Whereas the rest of us, my life might be, and I apologize for quantifying this, but my life might be $1 better. I don't know, $10 better if plastic bags went away. But the petrochemical industry, their lives are a whole lot better when policies go in their direction. Yeah. So with that, it's a difficult political calculation to know what's going to happen there. Another thing that I would say, though, and Dr. Jones, we'll see if we can disagree on this. I don't know. Maybe we can find some agreement here. When we talk about corporations owning the product, it's difficult to think about the legal aspects of what would happen next. But specifically, one of my questions is, who's going to pay for this? And so I would imagine, to the extent that we increase the price of plastics in different ways, it's not likely to be the companies themselves that pay for it, especially because these are goods that, whether or not we want them, we're facing those decisions where, like, well, if they're going to increase the cost, I'm going to have to pay that. Consumers are going to have to pay that. I know we'll talk about this a little bit more later. So I'd be interested for us to have a conversation about how do we actually shift the burden, and are we willing to pay for the higher cost of that would be required for the company to own the product life cycle?
Sure. And I would say that myself and the folks that are invested in this are willing to pay the higher cost for products, for the life cycle to be owned throughout, for the life cycle of packaging as well. And I can't help thinking that if soda companies were profitable in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when they retained the ownership of their bottles, and they people paid a bottle deposit and got a nickel back or whatever when they took their bottle back to the drugstore, that companies would still be profitable now with that extended producer responsibility. But you're right that it will never be. So that's the part of the internalizing the cost, right? So currently the economic equation reads like a soda producer's costs are the cost of buying the bottle, producing it, distributing it, and selling it, right? To go to an extended producer responsibility model incurs the additional cost of collection, cleaning, rebottling, and in that whole cycle. So I don't think that that's going to happen voluntarily. Right. So, but at the same time, and that is still profitable elsewhere in the world. You've been to countries, I've been to countries where soda is sold in bottles that are collected and redistributed. And I bought them, right? You bought them in those contexts too. So yeah, so I think that, I think that this question of who cleans up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is out there as a question. It's incredibly complicated, multinational question. And so folks who are in support of extended producer responsibility are basically see government as the arm of doing that for some categories of single-use products, for example.
And that's fair to say that if you're wanting an entire industry to move in one direction all at one time, it has to be some type of government action that's going to do that, unless there's some type of scientific breakthrough that would cause the price of the glass bottle to fall below the aluminum can, the plastic 2 liter.
Right.
Sticking with the soft drink example. But without some type of government intervention, I just did a really quick Google search from 1985 to today. The price of Coca-Cola stock has gone up 50 times. They're doing quite well.
Right.
And one of the reasons they're doing so well is because they keep their costs low. And they're able to entice people to come and buy their products because the costs are so low. It's not just affordable for middle-class families, it's affordable for everybody because
globally.
of that. Right, exactly. It is a global brand. So, and I know we can talk more about this later if we need to, but to the extent that we raise prices, and maybe it's just a U.S. raising prices here, because we know, as you mentioned, the packaging is different in different jurisdictions. So for that reason, we would imagine that prices would have to go up because of that. Coca-Cola, chemical companies, they will fight that. And consumers who are not as concerned with it, the cost to them would be higher. Right?
I know.
And not just higher monetarily, but also higher in the fact that they're not getting pleasure from having a glass bottle versus a plastic bottle. They want the half of the cost, and I want to say half the cost. Maybe it's a third of the cost off, but it's substantial enough to where that seems to be the dominant mover in the bottling industry. So anyway, more to talk about there.
And this absolutely depends on the recognition that the majority of single-use plastic packaging is made from fossil fuels, and a widespread belief that fossil fuels should stay in the ground. So some major contextual factors hamper the adoption of extended producer responsibility in many industries.
Some really, really good points raised there. The extended producer responsibility really does touch off on some tenets in sustainability when you think of circularity and the circular economy. So that's a very interesting concept. And thinking more about if Coke was to kind of promote that circular economy, what would that look like for Americans? Well, we'd see an increase in costs, but does that mean that folks in less developed nations should incur that cost? And then for me personally, just kind of went to, well, I want to buy the world a Coke, so some buzz marketing for them. Hey, if we're paying a higher cost for it, and folks in developing nations are reaping those benefits as well, I'm all right with that.
Sure.
And one thing for us to see there is the idea of corporate social responsibility. And so in a week and a half from now, the Super Bowl will have. And I'm not a wizard or a prophet, but I will tell you now that there will be advertisements that are telling us about the good things that the company is doing, not the product itself, not the quality of the product, but the quality of the good things in the world that they're doing. They will advertise that, and I'd like to think that advertisements probably work, and people will buy more of their product for that. So one of the good things that we can highlight here is that corporations are catching on to the idea that people want their they want their products to be built sustainably, to be made in a sustainable fashion. And when that wins in the marketplace, you can expect that every company will speed their way over the way to making their products in a more sustainable way, despite the fact that they might leave the oil companies in their dust.
Yeah. And Emily, I see we've got a slide up here. What do we have?
Right. So what we have here, and I'm going to make it there, is so that circular economy. This is the vision. This is the ideal that when folks talk about circular economies, when folks talk about circular materials economies, and extended producer responsibility plays in a role in this. So it's these two kind of intersecting but separate circles, which are on the left hand side, it's the biological and natural cycles, and on the right side, it's the technical cycles. So the ideal here is that to move away from a linear system where fossil fuel is extracted from the earth, made into a package, distributed, consumed, and disposed of in a linear path, that there's endless cycling with materials and goods. So there are multiple ways that this can and is already starting to work, but one and the in the packaging like retainment, ownership retainment is one of them. Also examples of like renting or leasing technical items like laptops, cell phones, etc. So those those metals and things are infinitely recycled. So just wanted to show that this is kind of the ideal here.
And Emily, I should have asked this with the very first question that we have, what are plastics? So I'm wondering if this graph will also help us understand that, there are some, if I can call it high grade plastics, right? And that whenever you reuse a plastic, it will necessarily go down a grade. Right. That over the course of the life cycle of plastics, when they are reused properly, they're going to go to lower grades until they're phased out completely. But the good thing of that is that we would see several life cycles from the one plastic. Yeah.
So that is what recycling is. It is with recycling plastic is a downcycling. The goal of this is to kind of conceive of all things that are used in the short term are returned to another form easily and in the short term. Mm-hmm. So when we say plastics, and I say what I'm really talking about is plastics made from fossil fuels that do not biodegrade. If we were to change those assumptions, plastic, just like I said, just means moldable during manufacture. If we have plastics moldable during manufacture that serve their purpose in keeping food safe and medicine applications and things like that, that are able to degrade and return back to an organic form and continually cycle through this material cycle, that's the goal. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that also do not use fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And green chemists are working on this, right? Like these are in development, and we need a wide scale implementation. Yeah, that's it.
And when those are developed to be commercial grade, we would expect there will be large scale adoption there. Their companies have every interest to do that once they are at the specific price point that we're wanting them to be.
Except the one challenge that we have is the infrastructure, and that the systems already exist for turning fossil fuel into plastics. So in order to turn, algae into plastics, we need a new set of systems that require, so it's not just, and help me out with this, Michael, this is my understanding that, but I would love to, I want your insight on this too, that the cost of conversion might be the barrier.
Sure. So once you have, let's say that one form of material, plastics is 10% cheaper than the other. So they transfer from glass to plastics. Well, then, as you said, they build an infrastructure. They build factories that are specifically made to do this one thing with plastics, and they have multi-year contracts with different petrochemical companies. I won't name them.
Sure.
So over the course of time, you have these fixed costs, And if you want to go to another form, something that is not plastic, chances are what you're going to need is an order of magnitude jump. You need the next thing that you go to be 10 times better. Why do I bring up that order of magnitude idea? A lot of the people who are thinking about the next wave of what transportation is going to look like. Think about the Teslas and those new companies that are coming along now and making economically viable transportation decisions for people to make. You can have an ICE, internal combustion engine car, or you can have an electric car, right? Until it is cheaper and easier to do that, you're not going to see that mass movement over. And so you need to have a fairly large jump to convince people, not only people, but companies as well, that this jump in productivity, in quality, is just significantly better, because, and this goes back to what you said, because there's already a lot of investment in what's there. So if it's significantly better, you can say, okay, we will recoup our investment over 10 years, but it's worth doing it because this is so much cheaper.
And I wonder if under our current systems, with solely free market economic principles, I can't imagine that the shift in plastic production would transform in the same order of magnitude, literally, that the cost of human, like the order of magnitude difference in value of going from human and animal power to fossil fuel power, and the 2 centuries wealth accumulation that accompany that.
Emily, you're right that when we look at the hockey stick of the Industrial Revolution, that it's almost impossible to match the jump in magnitude of what we have experienced because of fossil fuels. That said, I'm an optimist when it comes to science being the best innovator, engineering prowess that will take us down the way. And like you said, there's free market capitalism, but there's also the current administration is wanting to incentivize these things to be done. So likely, while I think that businesses will rise up that will do these things and will do them profitably, we can imagine that it's going to be a joint effort. And whether this administration lasts for 4 years, 8 years, or we have similar thoughts leading the EPA for 30 years, you can imagine when you put in programs in place, when they're popular, they stick around.
Sure.
So if something is put in place now and it works, we can imagine that it will stick.
Really great points raised there, y'all. Moving on, National Sword was a policy implemented by China in 2017, where the country banned the import of many waste materials, including low-grade plastics. Before the policy was instituted, China was importing 95% of all the plastics collected in the European Union, and a significant portion of plastics collected in the United States. Could you both speak on the impact that this has had both globally and nationally on the plastic recycling supply chain?
So supply chain is just the complicated idea of how do things get from point A to point B? How does it get from the raw materials in the ground through the manufacturers to your dinner table or to somewhere in your house where it's used by someone in its end state? So when China revoked its buying of all of these low-grade materials, essentially that sent a shockwave through the plastics recycling industry. The ability to kind of push our plastics aside and to not think about them because they're not here, we don't see them with our eyes, all of a sudden was gone. And so companies that specialized in making these sales to Chinese buyers had to rethink what's going on. While that's a negative in terms of what's going to be on US shores, perhaps that's a good shock that we can have, that it will start opening up people's eyes to what actually happens to plastics rather than, unless we can shoot it off into space, it's going to be right here. And we're not going to have many options other than to do something different.
Yeah. Dr. Jones, is there anything like that to that?
I agree. I think that what this did was open a lot of folks' eyes to the fact that this is a global, this is part of our global economy, and that recyclable materials don't get turned into, your milk jug doesn't get turned into another milk jug at your local milk factory. And that community recycling, that municipal recycling is bound by and constrained by economic forces. And there are multiple factors that shift commodity prices, including international agreements.
And that is a great point, and actually leads into our next question. And this is actually something that you've hinted at a little bit earlier. But one thing plastics have done is made small luxuries and necessities like, let's say, shampoo and deodorant, items that we associate with normal standards of living, accessible and cheaper to those who live in less developed parts of the world. What does equity look like in a reduced plastic or even a plastic-free future? And I'm going to toss this one over to you, Michael.
So I think the one truth that this reveals to us is the old saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So to the extent that there is a universal rise in price, if we were to either ban plastic bags or tax plastic bags or the different policy solutions, which we can talk about more later, to the extent that happens here and we're able to say, well, I really like it, but it's also, it hurts my pocketbook a little bit, but it's worth the cost. For people in other countries, specifically developing countries with lower levels of income, the percentage of their budget that rise in staple products would go up is substantial. And it's the same in the climate change debate as well. When we talk about the Paris Climate Agreement and the restrictions that we're trying to put on ourselves, well, we had a chance to use all of those things, which helped us grow as an economy, while many developing countries have not had a chance to grow in the same ways. The point being that when we think about the policies that we are trying to implement, we shouldn't just consider their effects on us, that we're willing to pay the higher cost. On the other hand, when we look at developing countries and the higher cost that they would have to pay, I don't want to be a doomsayer here that it's not going to kill anybody to have these higher costs, but it would hamper economic growth. These are real numbers when they get large enough to where there are people who will be kept in poverty because of it. Now, there's other ways that people are rising out of poverty. So this isn't some static example where it's the one factor that's involved. But we do have to consider that this is a pocketbook issue in a more serious way for developing countries than it is here.
Michael, I'm going to claim the reversal of that. I'm going to claim that, and I'm going to recognize that multinational corporations only began marketing and distributing their products to the developing world because the developing world was increasing in wealth, making that expansion into those markets profitable. It was only with rising wealth and changes in international trade agreements that made that possible. There was money to be made where there hadn't been money before. Correct.
Free trade is a good thing. I hope that, that's day one, right?
Right.
That's a good. So, and you're right, there is rising standards over the past 40, over the past 40 years, literally billions of people have risen out of poverty. And that's a wonderful thing. However,
it is a wonderful thing. And that has created purchasing power that has created markets for products. It wasn't the transformation of packaging from biodegradable packaging to plastic packaging that led to multinational corporations' expansion into the developing world.
So I disagree. Even more. It might just be a slight disagreement, but I think we have to acknowledge that plastic packaging, whether we like it or not, is cheaper, right? And so if incomes are rising, but prices are also falling. Go ahead.
So we can talk about basic human needs. We can also talk about the equity piece. Gosh, have you seen a documentary that featured, or been yourself and seen a slum in a developing country where there is, in a municipality where there is not waste disposal infrastructure. If anything, I think the equity issue right now is that we are that we as American businesses, stockholders, whatever, are profiting off of a product that there is not a safe sanitary way to dispose of in many of the places where we're distributing it.
I think one of the things we're highlighting is that this is not easy, right? This
is a complex question.
It's a very complex question, and I'm not dismissing that at all. That said, I would question our quickness to go towards rising, to raise prices on consumer goods and making the decision for them whether or not they should have it, whether or not they should be able to buy it at a higher price. My theory, and once again, theory is not practice, but my theory leads me to believe that the additional gain from buying these products is worth the cost, and it's a real cost of living in conditions that are not ideal. To the extent that we are subsidizing that our cost of trash is pushed off on other countries, that's probably not just economically wrong, but it's morally wrong too. And so the way we affect that problem is one thing. The way that consumers in other countries and the choices that they have to make is really complex.
Absolutely, absolutely complex. I do want to highlight one aspect of the way that we have changed our, working on my slide share here, changed our direction and in some ways been marketed plastic in order to not just fulfill the need, but to change the equation. Give me a second here. Here we go. So I am, oops. So I am in my, I'm in my 30s, and I teach students who are in their 20s, and I ask them to, it's as an experiment, as an experience during a particular freshman level class I teach, to put their, to choose one conversion from something that produces quite a bit of plastic waste to something that does not. Some of them forego plastic bags, bring their own. Some of them, choose all kinds of things. One student came in and she said, I'm switching from using body wash to a body wash bar. I was like, I'm not sure what she's talking about. She was talking about a bar of soap. 2 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, today, a bar of soap is the sustainable option as opposed to a bottle of body wash, right? Yeah. So I grew up, my family bought that Dial Gold on the left. I can smell it really poignantly because it was such a staple in our home. And we used that to wash our hands, right? We didn't use liquid hand soap, right? Like all of these changes happened really quickly. And if you compare the cost of a bar of soap to a bottle of body wash, it is an order of magnitude increase. It's not making or breaking anybody's budget, whether they're, buying body wash or in a bar form or in a bottle form, but it does represent many of the ways that products that historically were profitable at the low packaging, biodegradable packaging level are order of magnitudes more profitable in a different set of packaging. And for the most part, like my example with my student shows that like that has now become the baseline, right? The baseline shifted quite a bit. Here's another one of products that previously were sold in biodegradable packaging, paper, cardboard, that are now sold in plastic. And so this baseline of just the magnitude has shifted in such a way that that it is a very complicated problem.
Yeah, could not agree with you more there. And I'm gonna cut in here because we do have a couple more questions to get to before we get to our Q&A section. So I'm gonna combine two questions and actually put them to you both, but just try to be cognizant, and if you can, answer in 3 minutes, so that way we can get to the Q&A, as we have a bunch of questions that keep coming in. And so the first part of this question is gonna be for you, Michael. The great myth of recycling places the responsibility on the consumer and negates the responsibility of the petrochemical companies that produce the plastic and other corporations that use the plastic in their products. What kind of legislation could be enacted to correct this dynamic? And then the second part of that is going to be for you, Emily. You know, as we move to a more plastic conscious and plastic-free society, what could a holistic movement in the right direction look like? And I can repeat that when I throw it back at you, but for you, Michael, what kind of legislation could be enacted to reverse that dynamic of the responsibility from the consumer to more so the responsibility of the corporations and those producers?
Sure. So there's 3 different types of legislation, just in broad categories. There's regulation and specifically banning items. And usually we think about that for poisons, something that will kill somebody, something that should not exist. Okay, so that's one category. Another one is taxes, specifically when we know the cost of something. So if we know that driving a mile on the highway causes the roads to degrade, and it's going to cost, for every car that drives along that road, it'll last for 10,000 cars. Well, we should tax those 10,000 cars 1 penny each to pay for that road. Okay, so we have a gasoline tax. So if we know the cost of someone buying something and the cost of having a landfill or cleaning up that landfill, more specifically, because that's what we're aiming for, is a cleaner environment. Mm-hmm. If we know those costs, then we can tax. Problem is, that's a difficult question to answer. What is the real cost? And we're talking at the penny level here. Is it 24 cents or is it 25 cents? Because in a competitive marketplace, when I will make a decision between Pepsi and Coke based off of 10 cents difference, those pennies matter. So another way of doing this would be cap and trade. Usually we hear about this in the CO2 world, but also we could think about it in the corporate world as well. Procter and Gamble, Walmart, different companies are asked is a kind word, kindly of saying it, required to have a certain level of the goods that they make that are use certain packaging. Dr. Jones just did a great job of showing the differences there and how those are choices that are made. And the way that the trade part works is that some corporations will have a really easy job transferring from plastic to paper or plastic to glass. And so they could trade away their permits to use plastic to someone else who's having a more expensive time of doing it. The economist in me prefers the third example, but I'll also say that probably it's a mix of all 3 if our end goal is a cleaner environment and we're willing to pay for it.
Yeah. And Emily, for the question for you, just gonna put it back to you again. So as we become more plastic conscious in our society and move in the direction of hopefully becoming plastic free or reducing our plastic at the very minimum, what could a holistic movement in that right direction look like?
Well, it's got to be integrated between consumers, producers, every industry. So holistic is a tough one. Because I'm speaking to an audience now primarily of citizens, I would encourage citizen action to include things like working with your community, like with doing what you're doing now, obviously with us being in tune with a conversation that's happening in your local area, hosted by folks who are into this, excited and working on this topic, reading those, what's coming out from Metro Solid Waste, and speaking to your elected representatives, of course, one practical way that a student taught me, so this is a former student who is the environmental director of a chain, introduced this idea of really acting as if we believe that we are not responsible for packaging of the stuff that we want to buy from companies. So one good way to do that is when you go shopping, take your stuff out of the packaging to the extent that it's possible, and leave it in the garbage cans at the store. That pushes the cost back onto a unit that has incredible power over their suppliers to influence packaging decisions. So when I leave all my trash at a store, that store has to pay labor to pick it up. It has to pay disposal fees. And I'm signaling that those are economic costs that are not mine and are not my community's. And I don't want them. So you have them here.
Yeah. Kind of just
I like that. That's fascinating.
Sorry about that, Michael. What were you saying?
Oh, that's fascinating. And I think that's a good way of citizen activism. Yeah, I would be interested to see if a corporation ever said, you can't do that. That would be a fairly bizarre thing for them to say.
Yeah. And so it is almost 1 p.m. We do have one more question to get to before we get to the Q&A. So if you do have to leave, that is totally fine. We are going to be posting this to YouTube later today. And as long as you've registered, I will be sending that video to you via email. Both speakers are going to stay a little bit afterwards till maybe right around 1:30-ish to answer some of those questions. So if you do have a burning question, feel free to stay on. The last question I have is for you both. One of the major benefits of plastics is that they have the ability to allow us to live, work, and play beyond our natural world. That has provided us countless benefits, from exploring and studying the deepest, darkest reaches of our planet to beyond, and to sustainably improve healthcare, and that increase safety, affordability, and the quality of life to the computers and mobile screens we use every day. As a result, we realistically cannot expect to completely move away from all plastics, but there is clearly work that needs to be done and can be done. Where is a good place to start, and where can we as individuals make an impact while also not feeling overwhelmed? And Emily, you kind of just provided a very great resource for that. It's kind of just, as an individual, actively putting that cost of bearing the plastic directly on those stores before you leave. So that question is for both of you.
I'll put up something really quickly and cede most of my time to Emily. This is, think about that marginal concept again. Treat the things that you care about a little bit, care about them just a little bit more. This is just those marginal movements in your life. If you are a heavy plastic user today, don't go for zero tomorrow. Try to marginally get yourself in that direction, making small changes in your life. The reason I say that is not because I'm saying be one way or the other, but if you want changes to stick in your life, then the slower you do it, the more incremental it is, the more likely it is to actually work. And you're more likely to influence people in that way too.
That's a great point, and borne out by tons of research. So so start one way. I want to give a plug locally for a couple refill stores. If you shop in the area, the Good Fill and Sage Marketplace are two places to bring your own packaging and fill up on household cleaners, personal like hygiene cleaners. A variety of products are there and available for sale with either no packaging or packaging that you bring yourself. And you just pay for what you buy. You don't pay for your own packaging.
Yep. Love the Good Fill. Love Sage. Well, so thank you both for those. And that's going to conclude the panel discussion portion of this session. So I'm actually going to turn it over to the co-hostess with the mostest, Jenn Harrman, on those Q&A, so you can serve those up to our speakers now.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of them. A few of you, I have kind of thrown some responses back to you. If you did not catch our first series episode, we really do a deep dive into how Nashville's plastic is recycled here in Nashville. So if you have those questions, check out our first episode. We're not going to go back into that today, but I'm going to start pushing through these. There's a lot of really good questions. So let's pick a good one. I know this is one we got a lot of questions about. So the discussion of a possibility of a bottle bill in Tennessee. So there were just a lot of questions about if that's possible. Has that been pushed before? Is there interest or groups advocating for that? Also, I have been managing a lot of flying comments. So if I asked you something that you've already answered, please do let me know, because that could happen. But we'll start with the bottle bill question.
I'm not a part of those discussions. I know that bottle bills have been effective at increasing recycling rates in the communities where they've been implemented.
Yeah, that's fair. Once again, I'm not too connected to any of those conversations that are going on. So the effect of the program is one thing, and I have no reason to doubt that that's true. I would say the likelihood of something like that passing is probably fairly low. It would be more likely to pass at a local level. So statewide mandates are always more difficult to pass than local mandates.
And I will just throw in that here in Tennessee, there is, for example, like plastic bags, which let's go into that question, because there was also the question about the plastic bag ban. So which maybe this is just something to sum that all up. In Tennessee, there is a ban against banning things at the local level. So specifically, especially with plastic bags. However, there was a state push for a plastic bag ban that was introduced right prior to COVID that has not gone anywhere. I don't know if it is going anywhere, but it was actually supported by Kroger, as it's just part of their overall goals to get rid of plastic bags from their grocery stores. But those are things that there is kind of this unique dynamic, if you will, between the state and the local levels here in the state to be able to pass some of those types of legislation. So while I find the next question, if there's anything else you want to mention about plastic bag bans.
So you know, to the I'll be honest, I was not aware of the ban on bans. It's comical that some politician would think that they know how every locality should be run. That said, I don't believe that it's illegal for a company to ban something. So, for example, going to Aldi, you bring your own bags, right? So there are places that promote those ideas, and to the extent that we can encourage them by taking our business there, that's a good thing.
How can I find an extended producer responsibility campaign to support?
I would point you towards Break Free from Plastic as an organization. It's more of like it's more of a concept that's being applied to different industries. So there's extended producer responsibility work happening in the cell phone industry, for example, where people rent their devices for a period of 3 years or whatever, instead of buying and then rebuying. Interface Carpet does extended producer responsibility for all of their carpets. So this has been rolled out in several industries. I would even say like the repair programs of different companies, some clothing companies, will repair their clothing that you buy from them for the lifetime of it. That's an extended producer responsibility mindset. So I think just advocating for where you want to see those.
Wouldn't having the higher cost of plastic due to manufacturers owning the cycle of plastic be a good incentive to stop consumers buying single-use plastic?
Certainly, that's true, that consumers would go away. But what we're trying to, I guess we're trying to think through the eyes, through the mind of the corporation. So not only, so let's go back to Coca-Cola, our favorite example for the hour. If if you raise the price of Coke, it's not that they're going to say, oh, well, I'm going to go over, I'm going to buy Coke. No, they'll buy something else. They'll buy orange juice. They'll buy some other drink. They'll drink water for the day. Ooh, how bad would that be? That said, the purpose is not to have people consume less. Like that's a good goal, but it's not the point of this conversation. The purpose is for the corporations to still be able to run their business while at the same time being more sustainable in their packaging. So that if we want the corporations to buy into this, that's the way it would have to be.
Pick another one here. Can we at the federal level add a tax on what it costs cities to deal with packaging waste and then distribute that funding to cities to cover that cost? Then producers would be incentivized to lower the disposal cost.
Michael, did
These are tough questions and good, interesting questions.
So it's a tough question, and it's actually because it's a tough question that it's probably not going to happen, right? So when you have, the joke I always like saying, the federal government is really good at writing checks to people. They're really good at doing the same thing over and over and over and over. Right. And when you put on a one size fits all tax that is applied at the local level, that is really cumbersome. And while it could have good effects, I don't know, it could have good effects. The difficulty of actually having that be lived out might be more harm than it's worth. The cure might be worse than the disease. It might not have the intended effects, and it might be more burdensome, and there could be backlash that would actually hurt the movement to go against plastics. That said, maybe it could work. I don't know.
I think to the extent, if we're talking about what effective federal legislation would be on this issue and other issues, is backing up and remembering that most of our plastics are made out of fossil fuel, and federal stopping drilling for fossil fuels on public lands is a really kind of low-hanging fruit. And then beyond that, larger movements to keep fossil fuels in the ground and transition holistically to other sources.
There are special interests in that world, which is probably one of the reasons why it hasn't happened before. But I think that one thing that all sides can come around is at least let's stop subsidizing, these groups that one side doesn't like, and the other side at least says that they don't like subsidies for specific companies. So ending the subsidies should be something that's politically palatable. The problem is you can't stop corn subsidies and hope to win the Iowa caucus. So, oh well. I'm a cynic today.
It seems that water bottles are more flexible, which I believe that companies are using less plastic. Is there any data that supports that effort and shows the decrease in plastic use for water bottles?
So here's Javon's paradox at work, Michael. That's an economics term for you. So Javon's paradox is that in making something more efficient, we incentivize the use of more of it, ending up in a situation where any gains achieved by the greater efficiency are lost to the increased use, which is exactly what's happening with water bottles. So more people are drinking more water bottles, but each individual water bottle contains a third of the plastic that it did 20 years ago. We're not making any headway with plastic use for water bottles.
So that's a glass. My glass half full interpretation is that's an improvement, right? So
no, it's not an improvement.
No. Well, okay.
Because people are paying for something that comes out of their tap for almost free.
If people are okay, I will concede that it is certainly not better to be wasting more plastic. That said, if we believe that people were going to drink more water, and that might not be true, then it is a good thing that they are more efficient in their use of plastic, that there's less plastic being used. I'm closer to agreeing with you than with my point. So I'll put it out.
That's why you're fun to talk to.
Okay, so still kind of thinking a little bit in that same vein. So they just said can they use recycled plastic and be required to if available? Would that not eventually cut costs for all concerned?
So could corporations
That's
be
what I meant.
required to use recycled plastic if it's available?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably true. What I would be afraid of there is that they would shift the cost of that to consumers. So that's one of our issues there. But if it's a universal shifting, if all corporations are required to do it, then at least there's not a competitive pressure like, well, they weren't doing it, so we didn't do it. Yeah, that may or may not be the best way to do it, but certainly it would be a universal.
In your opinions, would quantifying environmental and social damage caused by corporations in the form of a robust carbon or other tax inspire a transition away from fossil fuels?
Yes.
Excellent. Check this one off the list.
Enthusiastic, yes.
Patrick, you mentioned, let's go back to the nudging idea eventually. When people are more aware of, for example, if the British government did this, where they sent out a letter to all tax-paying citizens and said 97% of people pay their taxes on time. They actually saw that those people who got that letter versus a form letter, the people who got the letter that told them about the good actions of the other people, their tax paying went up. They were more likely to pay their taxes. So when you make a cost visible, like currently it's invisible. I don't know how much it costs for me to pollute, but if I make that visible, we would expect that people are going to react to that in a way that is beneficial for the cause. Now the negative side would be the higher cost, and that we are not able to use our resources as efficiently. That's the trade-off we face.
I think this is a really good one. If plastic manufacturing or use is reduced, what happens to all the workers in the petrochemical and packaging manufacturing world? How many reduced jobs are acceptable?
Transition jobs are great. Yeah. So that's a big part of any comprehensive climate change plan is redistribution of jobs and creating more green jobs. So think of all of the industries, right? Think of all of the people who were paid to do jobs even 20 years ago that now machines do, or that you do, automatically with your computer. There was never that question, right? Like there was never the question of, well, if we implement ATMs, how many tellers are we putting out of work, right? So the automation thing has already happened, and fossil fuel jobs are, they're not that many as compared to what there used to be anyway, as mechanization has taken those jobs and as jobs have been outsourced. Yeah, I would say there are better jobs to be had.
Well said.
Can you talk a little bit about what makes plastic production so damaging to public health, especially low-income individuals and disenfranchised populations?
There's the situation of fence line communities, right? So communities that are near the fence line of production sites. And there are issues of air contamination, and disproportionately, those communities are communities of color. They're communities that are poorer. The terms and concepts of environmental racism and environmental justice relate to this reality that disproportionately people of color and low socioeconomic scale, people on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale have disproportionately are disproportionately damaged and disproportionately bear the cost of environmental especially disposal, but also production practices. And that's true globally. That's true in the state. That's true in the city. So those manifest in health and quality of life issues, as well as property value.
Let me, Emily, I agree with you on the outcomes of everything that you just said. Let me talk a little bit, though, really quickly. I think that the cause is reversed. So it would be horrendous for a corporation to say, we're going to build a factory and we're going to find the poorest neighborhood and put it down right there.
But I'm going to interrupt with you,
yeah.
Michael. There is Robert Bullard, is a sociologist, and he has proven that that's exactly what happens. That is really exactly what happens. It also was proven with the construction of the interstate system through cities, Eisenhower's interstate system, that it is explicitly stated, find the poorest, darkest communities to use eminent domain, destroy, and to buy up and tear down in order to build the interstate system.
So, okay, so let's say that there is an evil corporation, and the CEO and the head of planning of where the companies will go, let's say that they are evil. And maybe that's not too far of a jump for us. When they're planning out where the next factory should go, their profit motive would tell them to go to the cheapest place to go. And after they put it there, the property value will go down even more.
Yeah.
So if they're evil and if they're good, the exact same thing is going to happen.
It's not about good versus evil. It is a systemic, documented effect. And it was. I believe
that having it there is going to lower standards. You're going to go to places where property is cheap, and once it's there, it's going to further lower the price, the property values. So that's certainly true. But I have a hard time making the jump to say, therefore, they were evil in their intent, that they were racist.
I'm not claiming evil. I'm claiming they made a calculated decision to cite hazardous waste sites, landfills, chemical plants directly adjacent to communities of color. And it is really like, and it's across the South, it's across the North. It's not a US thing, it's a global thing. Like this is, there's just a lot of research to back this up.
Okay.
All right. Definitely some good talking points here. If consumers on the whole are more aware that containers, this is a less involved question. If consumers on the whole are more aware that containers like berry cartons, yogurt tubs, and clamshells are not locally recyclable, would they buy less of them? Which I know is, you can't necessarily, maybe you can't actually answer that, but I think it's an interesting question.
I think you'd have to study it. I think you'd have to first figure out who's aware, and then I think you'd have to follow their purchasing decisions without them knowing.
I agree with Emily. I think that we can make a good blanket statement that awareness is going to lower the cost of recycling, that it's going to, it will raise the amount of products that we are willing to put in their proper place.
Yeah.
I will say, as someone who is very well aware, I still occasionally buy strawberries and berries that come in those clamshell containers when it's off season. I do it. So, I think it's just a really interesting question because I do think about my own habits, and I think people do have more of that conscious awareness, but do you pick no strawberries, or do you pick, and that I don't know. I just think that's a very interesting question.
The thing you can do there is something someone mentioned, or I think one of Emily's students mentioned earlier, is how about this? You can bring your own container to put your strawberries in, check out with that clamshell, just leave it there.
Interesting.
That's an option that we could all be doing.
I've also started trying to grow strawberries. So right now that's like one a season.
That's a tough one.
So we do have a couple more questions. I'll throw out just maybe one or two more, and then we'll go ahead and cut this. So this one is, why are there single-use plastics? I don't see plastic going away anytime soon. So why isn't more being done to recycle it? Bigger question, why, we recycle all plastic bags to Kroger. We use our own bags whenever possible. If we could recycle more plastic, we would. Unfortunately, we know many people who don't recycle it at all. I'm going to throw out first that if you haven't watched, Dale, if you have not watched our first episode, do go back and watch that, because I think it'll address some of this, but I wanted to throw that to you all as well, about being done to recycle plastic.
I don't think more needs to be done to recycle plastic. I think we need to stop making plastic out of fossil fuel. Yes, the grocer would throw away the plastic container, and that's the point. Sorry, I'm responding to.
That's what the chat's there for.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. I think.
And the grocer would have to throw it away because it cannot be recycled, right? There's nowhere to send those clamshells. There's no one who wants to buy them to turn them into anything else. Mm-hmm. Right. That is the problem that makes me say, well, then we really need to back up and not make fossil fuels into plastics that cannot be recycled.
So let me offer this up here. Dr. Jones and I actually have a mutual friend who used to work in the sustainability department at Walmart. And one of the jobs that our friend did was is going down the supply chain, to the people that Walmart is buying from, because Walmart obviously is a huge buyer. And so when they tell their suppliers, we want you to reduce waste, we want you to use less packaging. That plastic doll that I'm buying for Christmas for my daughter that has 5 different wires tied around her, get rid of those. Large corporations have the power to do it. And that's not obviously as visible as it is than other things. But if Walmart has extreme amounts of power, we as individuals have smaller amounts of power, but it's power nonetheless. And so when we make consumer decisions, don't think of yourself as a small power broker. Think of yourself as part of a larger river that is rushing through. And when there are many of us doing it, they have no choice but to pay attention to the trash that we're leaving in their trash can. I really love that example. It's great.
I'm glad you do. I knew you would. Well, hey, I've got to jump off. I could probably do one more question, and then I've got another appointment to get to. I
think the majority of the questions that we have left are things that you have in some way already touched on. So cool. I think this is a really great spot to end our presentation today. So appreciative of both of you. I know I'll be going back and rewatching this probably a couple of times, and really appreciate all of your time to talk today to us about plastic. Again, I've got our next session up here. I will show you that information really quick. So don't forget to follow us, check out our newsletter. Those links were in the chat to check out our newsletter and follow those to check out our next session, which is creating a smart yard, composting, pollution prevention, and planting native. So we are jumping into the spring gardening season for our February session. So please do sign up for that, register for that. And if you've got any questions, Patrick at urbangreenlab.org or jen.harman at nashville.gov. Patrick, you got anything else?
I just want to give a special thank you to both Dr. Stutzman Jones and Dr. Crouch. Thank you all so much for joining us today and really just peeling that veneer back on the economics behind recycling and big plastic. So thank you.
This was awesome. I really appreciate all y'all. And thanks for putting this message out to our community.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, and thanks to everyone who joined.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.